Welcome to my podcast. I am your host, Cédric, and let's get going. Today I
Okay.
am joined by,
Crack Bear.
okay, so, let's,
How's it going?
great. First subject that we have prepared is the ethics of eugenics.
Yeah.
So obviously there's many problems with the idea of eugenics because the main idea that the main process by which it is done is by selective breeding, and so if we applied it to humans, some people with less good genes can see it as an assault on their individual freedoms, which it is. But
Yeah.
there's always some
Well, I mean, I think even that characterization of saying people with worse genes, I think that is something that really gets to the point of what is problematic about eugenics, right? Like, if we talk about the ethics of eugenics, one, we have to create, a kind of value system in which we can quantify and essentially monetize human beings. Because we have to be able to say, this is a good person, this is a bad person physically, and how we want to eliminate the bad. That's the purpose, is to, and usually people make arguments about diseases, but then it gets really gray really fast and really, really tricky really fast when you start talking about, how would this used if, let's say that this was done in a racist mechanism, like it was done in the 70s and 80s on Native American reservations in the United States? Or what if it's done in a way, let's say, against some people, against, like, let's say, deaf people, a community that does not consider itself disabled or does not like to be called diseased, that the totalitizing logic of eugenics would label that as worthless and therefore exterminable. I mean, I think that's like the whole mechanism of attributing value to genes gets really, really tricky, right? Like, really, I'd personally say just bad. But
yeah, I agree with some points, but I disagree on the premise because as I noticed when I talked about it with other people and simply doing some research, because when last year I did a little research project for an ethics class in college. So that's where I get the idea from. The word eugenics, because of the history of it, is extremely loaded. So
well,
there's an extreme amount of connotations which doesn't need to be, because the idea of eugenics is it's in the dictionary. It's not seeing humans as worthless and wanting to exterminate them. It's to try to make an effort by selectively choosing better genes and promoting them, and trying to get less people having genes that cause suffering, and that would make an improvement to the population via the genetic aspect of what constitutes their body. But
let's agree on a definition, right? We have to agree on what we mean by we say eugenics. And so if we want to just go with the straightforward dictionary definition, the science of improving the human population by controlled breeding to increase the occurrence of desirable heritable trait characteristics. Is that a fair definition, would you say? Okay, so so let's nail that down here when we're talking, just so that we know we're talking about the same thing. And I think that a lot of the critiques I brought up still, because the problem I was trying to point out was that you get into this dehumanization when you talk about desirable heritable traits, right? Is deafness desirable? Well, the deaf community would say, yes, it's fine. It's not a big deal. Same with dwarfism. There are little people don't consider themselves, inherently disabled. However, on the norm, people would consider it diseased and undesirable. And so while you may not be directly saying we are looking to exterminate that, by selectively choosing the desirable ones, you in effect are, right?
I'm not sure I follow some details of it, because I know the argument, but the point that I disagree on is that because a lot of people, for example, with various aspects of disabilities like deafness and others, like people say there's a community of people with this trait that is not desirable, therefore saying that this trait is undesirable is saying that these people with the trait are not desirable themselves, which is not the case. We can all agree that it's better to be able to hear than not being able to hear, although the adaptability of the brain when you don't have one sense, it rewires itself to adapt by using the other senses better. But I would make the argument that more senses better, because of course, if we, for example, deafness, speaking orally is extremely useful, and so it's not I don't think that you can defend the proposition that eugenics is by default a dehumanizing thing.
Well, it's not that.
It's
not the idea. So, like, you made the clarification that just because someone has an undesirable trait does not mean that they're undesirable people. But I would argue that under the very ideology of eugenics, which is the idea of removing undesirable traits, is that it requires a value judgment on that person. Like, we are saying, when we conform to this idea, let's say we find a trait X is undesirable, then people who have that trait fall onto that undesirable category. I mean, you can maybe say it's not as strong as a statement as saying that they're undesirable, but I would argue that it's the same implication when it comes down to whether or not that person should exist, because that's the argument you're making.
No,
you're making the argument. No, in a way. Like, that's the eugenics argument, is that, like, we should not allow people like this one to be recreated. Maybe not to...
The argument is that if we have... Hold on. Give me a second. Someone's phoning me now.
Okay.
I hung up. Anyway, the argument of eugenics is not we should kick out or kill people because they have less good traits. It's that if we are to have certain people living, we should make efforts so that the people who actually live, instead of just not existing, it would be better if those people who had the time to live and experience life, if it would be good if they did not suffer as much. That's the argument.
The thing. That's the thing. You're trying to, like, avoid this argument tries to avoid the actual the thing of making that value judgment when it has to implicitly, right? I'm not saying that eugenics would go out and, round things up. But, I mean, here's a perfect example of how eugenics was used in this way in the 1970s and 80s on Native American reservations. In Native American reservations, there was, I don't know if it was a state-sponsored policy or if it was just like one like crazy doctor, but they started secretly, what's it called when they tie up women, when they make women infertile? Essentially, they would surgically infertilize women on the Native American reservations without telling them at the tribal or the reservation sponsored health clinics, right? And that is where you get into this, like, value judgment. That is a way, because it's the genericness of this desirability, right? Because to that doctor, to that he was following a eugenics practice because he was saying that the trait of being Native American is undesirable to society. That was his argument. And so that's where I think that you can draw a lot of the ethical problems out of, is that desirability is not an inherently good term. Like, we can think of multiple examples where desirability is used to hurt people, right? Like, we can think of societies where the society actively tried to get rid of undesirables, but the undesirable, is not always, getting rid of malaria. It's not always getting rid of, cystic fibrosis. While those may be helpful traits, and those would be, edge cases where you could say, well, maybe if the baby has cystic fibrosis, maybe it is worth, trying to retrying. However, even then, I think you can make the argument that you don't get to decide what the worth of a life is. And so I think that's where we get into this problem, right? Is that the desirability aspect is too generic and too broad. And so by selectively breeding humans, you are implicitly creating a value spectrum, right, that humans fall onto. And that can lead to really sketchy situations.
It's true that that power is abused, and some people that are utterly reprehensible abuse their power and try to justify it in a half-assed manner. So we don't disagree on that point. So, but I think that it's more on the specifics and in terms of when and how the eugenics policies are actually put in place and conceived. It's that thing where the big problems arise, because of course it's not necessarily true that if you conceive a policy that it will automatically make things better, which is the point of the discussion of we should find out what's the best way to approach the goal of improving the genetics of our populations, so that there's not abuses, so that it doesn't cause the non-abuse negative consequences, because there are potentially some negative consequences, even if it's not a direct abuse of power that is that causes far more suffering than what it purports to make better.
Well,
so
first, I would personally call into question whether or not the goal of improving society's genetics as it is formulated in that way would be a inherently ethical goal. I think that's a disputable. I don't know. I wouldn't say necessarily it's wrong, but I'd say that's not a granted. Secondly, I'd say getting into the meat and the details and the technical aspects, I think kind of is the wrong way to approach this issue. I think it might be more helpful if we look at it from ethical frames that have been pretty well accepted, or at least understood. So if we look at let's say a Kantian frame of eugenics, under a Kantian frame, it can get a little complicated, because you get into the ideas of the ultimate maxims, right? But I think the most interesting part of the Kantian frame that comes down to autonomy, right? That humans must always be the ends, not the means, or that we always must respect a human's autonomy. And that's where it gets interesting for eugenics, right? Because are we respecting people's autonomy before they're born? Can you disrespect a pre-born human's autonomy? That's an open question that I don't know how to answer. But also, if you have a population with a trait that ends up on the chopping block, are you disrespecting their autonomy by saying that, you don't get to choose, that you don't get to affirm your existence, right? Because if a person has this undesirable trait and then that trait is chosen to be removed, are we in a way saying that your existence cannot be affirmed? that they don't get the choice or the ability to say that they like to live because we have deemed them with something that we consider unlivable. That's why we're removing it. We're not removing the traits just because it kind of sucks. We're deeming them unlivable. That it's not worth creating a human with this trait. That is the frame. And so I think when you talk about, removing genetic traits, it's hard. I'd say in any context, when you talk about genetics, it's very, very careful. And you have to be really aware of the people who exist with those genetics and if genetics should be the way we measure people's existence in the first place.
I'm still not certain that about the part of directly tying ethics into the genes directly, because what at least I, not maybe not others, but at least me, I'm not saying in any way that there is any kind of judgment about the value of a person when I'm saying that one of the traits that they have is undesirable. I think we can both agree on that.
Well, I think that the implicit. Okay, so let me put it like this. I don't think that the argument is directly saying person X is undesirable, that they are bad. But I think that it's not a far step. And I think it's almost an implicit conclusion, right? Because it's not just that we're saying that trait is undesirable. We're saying that we shouldn't even try to attempt to create people with that trait. Because that's what we're trying to remove it from the gene pool, not necessarily from the current population, because we're not saying go and get rid of them, at least at this stage. What is being said though is that that we shouldn't even attempt to create people with such trait by removing it entirely. Which even with eugenics, it can get, especially that when you get even the mechanics of that can get very weird. Like should death? Let's not get into that. But yeah, that's where my argument comes in. Anti-eugenics is that I don't think you can make a claim by saying I don't think you can effectively distinguish between the individual and the trait when you're talking about removing it from the rest of human history, right? I mean, that's just my thoughts on it.
Yeah, it's one of the gray areas that we can encounter in philosophy. What makes a person, and how do we draw the line between existing persons and potential persons?
Yeah.
So, I mean, one of the ways that I would address that is that the people who matter are the people who exist and the people who are conscious. That's where most of the morality lies, because of course if we have a bunch of pain neurons that are just existing and they're stimulated, they still don't have any moral value because they're not conscious. But on the other hand, if you have a fully formed human being which has pain caused by another human being which does so just for the sake of inflicting pain with no other positive aim in doing so, there is a big moral value in that situation. Compared to a bundle of neurons which are just existing in the void, let's say.
I mean, I think that it's fairly reasonable to say that the domain of ethics could be mainly restricted to the alive, or the currently alive at least. Whether or not that's the full domain, I think you can make an argument that we could include other things. I think a lot of people do. But we have to actually. I think that with this question of eugenics, I don't think you can analyze it without including the unborn. Or without, I mean, we could look at it, because if we look at it from just the currently living, then we only have the ability to question about us talking about the existing people who have the problem. And so, and that's where it gets muddy, because there are problems that are easy to say we don't want that, right? Like cystic fibrosis. That's not good. I mean, I'm thinking of the right thing. It's where your lungs fill up with fluid and you have to drain them every year. That is inherently bad. I don't think a single person with cystic fibrosis would say, I enjoy this. But the thing is, when you use eugenics as just a blanket philosophy or a blanket ideology on how we should manage populations, that's where I would argue the ethics of it get very questionable, right? Because and you could always make the argument that we're just going to restrict it to this domain, or we're just going to restrict it to these 5 diseases. I think the base ideology, when applied at a population level and at a generic level, is where I think my critiques really hit. Is that it's when it comes down to, and is that while you could make cases and policies that ignore maybe the sketchier cases, you still have that ideology behind it that like encourages those sketchier cases. And then at that point, it's whether or not we're okay with an ideology encouraging such things. And that's the realm of the ethics.
And there's a lot of, in fact, an infinite amount of ways to look, because of interpretation itself, how we view a certain trait, whether it's deafness, blindness, or any illness. Like there are some cases which everyone agrees there's a trait that's negative, but because there are so many traits and so many ways to look at them, because of course the world is multifaceted, so it's hard to really make a clear-cut judgment. That's where I think, from what I understand, part of your argument is that this is one of the causes of many of the problems that we have, which is that what counts as a trait that is undesirable. There's a lot of people who have wildly varying opinions on that, and therefore the danger is that there are many traits which some people might not consider it to be very undesirable, because either they can cope with it, or by itself the trait isn't even bad. But if there is another person who sees that trait as bad, then the judgment of saying that the trait, there should be less of it, when it is actually set into motion in the form of eugenic policies and other mechanisms, then there's the problems of infringing on the persons that have the trait, and at a philosophical level, it's an infringement.
Yes, I think that sums up my argument pretty well, or at least a part of it.
So what's the missing parts?
I think that's probably it. I'm trying to think back. I should have taken notes, but that's essentially what I was getting at. That you can't argue like that. The critique is at the desirability, right? It's the broadness.
Yes, I think so.
Yeah.
So then this is why we need to make some very pinpointed choices of a set of agreed upon traits that everyone could agree that it is desirable or undesirable. And so this is because of course we can all agree that if there were less of the traits that cause us suffering, it would be better. So then the question that presents presents itself to us is, what do we do then?
Well, there are ideas and schools of ideas and philosophies based around the idea that suffering is inherent and that removing suffering is not inherently unethical or necessarily an ethical conundrum, right? Like you could have existential philosophies, like such as like Kierkegaard. Maybe I'm crediting him wrong, but the idea that suffering is just part of existence. And so, I mean, that gets to the more existential question of the pointness of like, should we bother selective breeding, given that it's gonna have like their existence is going to be as ours anyway. Also, I think that trying to like just pinpoint down, like, let's say we have a list of 5 or 6 diseases that we say are agreeable, whatever, that let's say we could somehow find a way to find them universally agreeable.
Well, there's many ways in which we can categorize certain traits so that we can like more in a more standardized way, and it not being only, oh well, let's say cystic fibrosis and then deafness and then there's another illness. That's the 3. And that's the only one that will take care of. Of course, people will say that's arbitrary as fuck. And people, I
would argue that it's always going to be arbitrary, and that there's no way to make a non-arbitrary list of human traits that are desirable. Except, I don't. I mean, you could maybe argue like fatal illnesses,
incurable ones.
Yeah, incurable illnesses that are fatal, such that if a baby was born with said illness, the chance of surviving is 10% or some limit that is acceptable for the discussion. So let's say it's 10%. I think that is the point where you can say that this is but then that's a cost benefit analysis of whether or not the pregnancy should be carried to term, not if we should selectively breed it out, because the methods by which this selective breeding out happens is, we haven't even gotten into how eugenics implementation works, because it's not like you screen the baby and say this baby has a chance of having a genetic condition where its heart may, be in half. And so we'd have to go in there and sew it back up, which is something that has people happen. I've had a friend back in middle school who had that happen to him. So he had a big scar down his chest where they had to do that to save him. But that's not the methodologies we're talking about here. Eugenics methodologies usually have to do with a more strict version of population control. It's more about, stopping the undesirable traits from even reaching the pregnancy stage. Right? So it'd be like an implementation would be more akin to state mandated birth control than it is to, telling a mother that her baby might have a severe defect and it might complicate the pregnancy and risk her life as well. It'd be like, maybe like a late term medical abortion. And I think that difference is important when we're talking about it, because we could talk about it in the abstract of traits that we find undesirable, and that's essentially what the topic we've been talking about. Like, does desirability cause a problem here? Which I would say yes, but we can also talk about the implementation as well, because while we could just be saying we're trying to remove those traits, it's also how we're trying to remove those traits. Because it's not like people are saying, it's not like, stopping smoking, where people are like, hey, just don't smoke. It's like saying these people want to have a baby, their genes are bad. By the definition of the ideology, they're bad. So they shouldn't. Right?
Yeah, I think. So how to implement the eugenic policies is the most important thing. And as you said, if we have government-led authoritarian policies that infringe massively upon people's freedom and bodily integrity. That's abominable, plain and simple. And what I would advocate for on my side is that if we have a voluntary programs to encourage people to make the best choices concerning their child, if we have better genetic technology, because that's one of the other main things, I would lump genetic modification and other stuff like gene therapy into eugenics. But that we can argue if that's a good choice concerning the definition of the word. But it's the best thing, in my opinion, is that the people who already exist, if we have genetic technologies that helps them be better or cope with their existing illnesses, that's the way to go. And that if we have, for example, sperm banks and egg banks with people who have less of certain inheritable traits or illnesses, I mean, if parents can use that, it will not infringe as much on their freedoms as, let's say, forced castration and involuntary abortions, which is we both agree, abominable, because it's a major infringement upon your bodily integrity. And
yeah, I mean, I think we could definitely both agree that like the I think China has been using the state sponsored birth control type of eugenics. I'm not 100% on that, but I don't know. I don't know if genetic modification goes in with it depends on what you mean by genetic modification, because we could look at genetic modification like in the cases where a baby is born with a genetic defect and they use genetic modification as a way to try and save that baby's life, which I would say is different, because you're still keeping the trait alive in a way, because you're still keeping the person alive. And I think that's where I think the importance of the ideology behind eugenics is, in understanding what it means, because it's about whether or not, because in the example I just brought up, the context is we have a person and we're trying to save them, not, let's determine if a person or if two people are worthy of creating a person. And genetic modification could be used in a way that is a eugenic style, right? We could try and genetically modify prospective parents to give the ideal traits. I don't know if that's actually a possibility using genetic modification, but that would be a possible example of, let's say, eugenic genetic modification. However, lumping it in plainly, I don't know if that's completely fair, but I don't think it's the biggest deal.
Yeah,
but then we get...
Go on.
Yeah. Oh, no, that... Go ahead.
Okay, so I think I was going to say that, and that's one of the reasons that I brought up the question of, I don't know if it's a good idea to group genetic modification and selective breeding together into eugenics, but I mean, we might, but I don't know if I don't know if we should move the goalpost, so to speak, between from eugenics to genetic improvements in general. But
yeah, because because that's a broad thing, and there's even like questions of how genes, like we don't truly understand how genes work to some degree. Like we have like a science around it, and they're researching it and they're learning, but we don't we can't say like if we remove this gene exactly, then it will solve this problem. Like it's not it's insanely scary complex. And that's another, I guess, a reason for another one of my criticism / skepticism of the idea of the grand notion that we're gonna help the world by removing genetic suffering, because I'm skeptical of of how that can be interpreted and how that can be applied and how it's historically been applied, I think. And that's why I think most of my arguments focused on the desirability, because historically that's where the meat of this gets really, really, really gross, is the undesirables of like what is considered undesirable. But I mean, if like, let's say we found a way to take it to where like a mom, or like, let's say two adults want to have a baby and they can both take a pill, and that pill would make it to where it decreases the chance of the baby having cystic fibrosis or having, I don't know, many genetic disorders. Hunter's disease, I guess. I'm not exactly sure what that is. I remember that being a genetic disorder. But if they can maybe take a pill and just reduce the chances, I don't think that necessarily falls into it falls under the critique, but I think there's a way out, because you're saying like you're not necessarily, trying to like selectively breed people out. Instead, you're like, just trying to reduce the chances of a fatal disease. I don't know if Hunter's disease is fatal. I forgot. Let me look that up. Hunter syndrome. Hunter syndrome is the only MPS syndrome. Okay. Signs and symptoms. But yeah, I don't know. I think that's like the complexity of genes kind of also throws an interesting hook into this debate.
Yeah, there's not a lot of monogenic diseases compared to the other diseases, which are caused by the interplay of many different genes. So this is why the thing that I advocate first before anything is done is more genetic research, because I mean we're as you know, we're speaking like in a philosophical framework, more so than being
a scientific,
more so than being simply concrete and say let's do this now. But we can't, because we don't have enough genetic technology yet. But I think that it's a conversation that really needs to be had, because if we know that if we make efforts to improve the genetic makeup of our populations, then if these efforts make things better, then there's something that we could get. And so how do we get it? That's one of the things that's the most tricky, but that's why we need to have a discussion about eugenics, so that we are not going to the extremes quite yet, and we have to find what's the best ways that we have.
Yeah.
As in what parameters should we pick of how we should implement eugenic policies, and as in weighing the different things that go against one another, like determining if and when, and also how much we should weigh in the potential persons versus the actual persons. And
I think the discussion could even be focused on if we should do eugenic policies in ideology in general, because I'm not necessarily saying that that means we should never talk about it. I think that we need to talk about it to go over why we shouldn't or why we should. And I feel like that's why we need to say, like, okay, why shouldn't we do this or why should we do this? And while we could like try and like, and I think forcing down to the concrete level in some cases can ignore the sides, like, you know, like the abstract objections at first, right? Because it's like when we talk about, like, let's say we look at the economics of eugenics, or not necessarily economics might be a bad term, but if you look at like in an unequal system with severe income inequality, would eugenics be marketed, and how would it be marketed, and would it be commercialized, which leads to interesting questions of things like designer babies, or would upper classes be able to physically and genetically mark themselves as upper class through eugenic tendencies? And this is where it all gets, like, you know, I think that maybe the question shouldn't even be how should we do it, it should be if we should do it. And I think that's like a more functioning question that really gets into, like, I think a lot of the critiques of it, and that the critiques, some of them aren't just, you know, go straight forward into saying eugenics as an ideology is bad. And I think that, you know, it's always hard to remove those arguments unless you go like super concrete and kind of ignore them, which I'm not saying you are, but I'm saying, like, by ignoring the abstract critiques, it can be seen as a way to try and like fast track it without actually going for or against it. Maybe. I mean, that was a little rambly. Don't know if I said much.
I ramble a lot too. So to address like two of your I don't know if they're concerns or questions, because one of them is a concern, I think, and the other is a question. Why should we practice eugenics? Well, here's a quite simple argument, is this. There are genetic diseases. Genetics is not something which people deserve. So, therefore, given that genetic diseases cause suffering unjustly, we can argue it is universally morally a moral good to try to pursue the removal of genetic diseases. Now that's only saying that it's better to have less genetic suffering than to have more genetic suffering. So that argument isn't very specific, and it isn't very strong. But this is my argument of why it is good to pursue eugenics, in the sense of simply the ideal, and not saying anything about the implementations that anyone might come up with. And secondly, your thing about economic inequality, and how different people of different economic strata might have different access to these technologies. Richer people probably will use more genetic enhancing operations or technologies, but also at the same time, probably they won't if the technology is not fully perfected. So I don't know for sure about the future, but although it's certain that that people with more means will jump at the opportunity to make themselves more performant in terms of genetics, which is tackling one of the vectors which are which have not yet been attacked, which is the genetics. It's something very raw. It's directly our bodies. So of course it's one of the things that combines into the rest of our of what makes us, such as our abilities in terms of knowledge and expertise. Adding genetics to that is obviously it's obviously gonna mean that people who can and see the benefit will aim to pursue the genetics to enhance themselves. But at the same time, I'm sure that they won't enhance themselves too much, because if they pursue increasingly experimental treatments, it will be extremely risky. And so I would make the argument that as I said, I'm not entirely certain of what will happen in the future, but people who are already rich, I think that they won't take a risk that is too great, that would, if they have, let's say, a genetic surgery or something, they won't do it if they see a risk that is too big, that will ruin their whole body. But
I mean, I guess I get that reasoning, and that, like, you know, it just depends on, like, you know, whether or not someone will use this technology obviously depends on the state of the technology. But I do feel like the justification you gave doesn't necessarily have to justify eugenics, right? Because it says, essentially, what it does say for sure is that we should try and reduce genetic suffering, I think was the conclusion of your argument. And I think that the question of if eugenics fits right at the end of that conclusion, right? It's like, sure, let's take that value. Let's say we should try and reduce genetic suffering. Then the question becomes, is eugenics the set of practices we want to use? Or are there other practices that we can use that we can find better? And I think that's where my question of if eugenics becomes the main debate, is like, why this version of eugenics, especially since eugenics historically and even recently has been used in very, very sketchy ways and been completely taken up the mantle by specifically white supremacists. And so, I mean, honestly, white supremacists also will just take any science about genes and just, you know, contort the crap out of it. But, like with the milk thing. But I think that the question of why eugenics and if eugenics are the most important questions about this. And I think that there's a pretty strong case that it shouldn't be eugenics, that we should maybe look for other sets of methodologies.
Why not a combination of both?
I mean, that's possible. I mean, that's the thing with these sets. You can kind of pick and choose. But I think the main critiques, especially when it comes to the desirability, come down to the core ideology, which is what causes some problems. Because I think that the problem I was trying to point out with eugenics is the assumed desired, undesired dichotomy, and with that, and you're trying to prevent the undesired from existing in the future, instead of other genetic technologies, which may, you know, say take a child who has a fatal trait, and then they try to fix it, which is a after the fact type deal. It's less of we're trying to remove this trait, and it's more of like this trait appears. How do we solve this problem? Because then, you know, that logic requires that there at least be a functional problem to some degree. Like, if it's not lethal, then the question of the trait doesn't appear, except for other than maybe in management if it's a severe genetic trait. Because that's where it gets, when you talk about genetics, it's so broad, it's the entire body in a way. So that's where you get into this things, because then, eugenics and like definitions of what is desirable in genes is what's, the basis of a lot of scientifically racist arguments in the early 1900s. And also, and that's, I think, where like the main critique of eugenics comes. Is that maybe I'm repeating myself, but I think that's and the other technologies might not have that same philosophical problem that is inherent in the methodology.
Yeah, you really nailed it.
Thanks.
Do we have other things
Topics?
to? No, I mean in eugenics, do we have other stuff to discuss?
I mean, unless you have something you want to talk about, I have essentially said my piece. And I feel like we discussed it fairly in depth.
We might talk about the designer babies.
Yeah, those are a weird.
It's not a moral good, because from what I understand, the term designer baby is to denote the effort of picking how the child looks like. For example, the hair color.
Yeah, that
the
would
eyes.
be part of it.
What other parts would it be?
I mean, you could have like functional things, like you could like in this, whether or not this is actually possible, I have no idea.
Might be,
like,
but probably not yet.
Probably not, definitely not yet. But of like, in like not only changing like the skin color or the eyes or the ears or whatever, but also things like making them superior to humans in some way. I don't know if that's actually possible. It could just be science fiction. I know Russia was trying to make it look like they could do that. Like a year ago, they were trying to convince everybody they had genetic super soldiers, and everyone was like, "No," but I don't think it's possible. Definitely, at least not yet. I don't know if it's someone with genetics should probably do genetic.
I mean, we could imagine some parts of how the body works being related to genes. For example, if we could make the muscles more efficient with a certain gene, then that would count as a genetic modification. So it probably is possible. And so, like, if we have a parent that chooses for its child to have a certain trait, I argue that that only those that are functional and that give an improvement are justifiable. But there's some interesting gray areas of if one trait, because of the multifaceted nature of the world and genes in specific, that there's some traits which, if increased, would slightly decrease other abilities. So if relative to the default state of human, or what the child would have been if the child hadn't been selectively modified genetically, how do we calculate if the improvements are worth the other the drawbacks, let's say? I don't know. I think it's a fun little question.
I mean, I think that that comes down to a cost benefit analysis, right? Like, you have to say like the cost of the modification is this, and then the benefit, like, oh well, the cost of the modification makes it to where they have to sleep like 15 hours on average instead of 8. But They have increased. I mean, this is like pure science fiction ruminating, but I mean, if this is under this thought experiment, you just have to at that point, I think it becomes, and it's whether or not I think the ethical question comes in for that of whether or not we can do that analysis for somebody else, right? Because it's not a question. It's changing their.
Go on. Sorry.
Oh, so I was just saying, I have a baby, and I can choose that it has this drawback benefit pair. So I have to make the decision for a future individual, and this isn't some imaginary individual. It's in embryo, and we're expecting to go to term, and we're expecting to give birth, and we're expecting to raise it. So this is, at this point, I think you could argue if that is the context of expected birth, expected to term, expected raising, all that stuff. This is a real child that you're talking about in some degrees, and whether or not you can make these cost-benefit analysis for the child, or even anybody, would that be overruling their autonomy? Especially since it's a big thing. It's like the basis of their existence is fundamentally changed from yours or from what everyone else starts with because you decided that they should have something put onto them, which I think is, if you want to go with a high autonomy value, then I would say you probably can't make that call. But one could argue the cost benefit method of saying, well, they'll never get malaria or something like that. I don't know.
Well, what I was going to say is that it's not a question of if we can, but if we should.
Yeah.
Just transition.
Okay, so first, we're going to talk a little about the philosophy of horror. A lot of this information we're talking about is actually, if you want to, anybody listening, or if you want to actually learn more about it, there's a great book series from Zero Books called The Philosophy of Horror. It's starts within the dust of this planet, Starry Speculative Corpse, and Tentacles Longer Than Night, and they're all by a contemporary American philosopher, Eugene Thacker. And and the book is written quite well. You don't have to be super deep into philosophical jargon to understand it. He does a good job of kind of bringing up concepts as necessary and explaining them without becoming overly verbose. So I highly recommend. That's where a lot of this philosophy comes from. But so let's start with, first we need to make a distinction between the world, what's called the world for us, the world in itself, and the world without us. And let me see. I have a quote here which could help explain. So a brief overview is the world for us would be the world that we have created, the world that bends to human wills, the world that we interact with. The world in itself is the world in an inaccessible, already given state. So essentially pre-human interaction, but it's kind of paradoxical because as soon as we attempt to imagine or act it, it becomes the world for us because we have to imagine it through a human lens. And this world is, for the most part, to our knowledge, either indifferent or against humans. It's hard to make a statement that the world in itself is pro-human. And then the world without us is the concept not of extinction, but of an inhuman world, a world of inhumanity, of no humanness at all. And it can even be, you can't simply thought of it as an extinction. It's more of a limit of a thought because we can't really think outside of human experiences. And so it's more of the limit of what if the world wasn't human at all. And so let me see if I can find that quote real quick. Okay, yeah. Is this everything? So yeah. Let us call the world in which we live the world for us. This is the world that we as human beings interpret and give meaning to. The world that we relate to or feel alienated from. The world that we are at once a part of and that is also separate from the human. But this world for us is not, of course, totally within the ambit of human wants and desires. The world often bites back, resists or ignores our attempts to mold it into the world for us. Let us call this the world in itself. This is the world that is some inaccessible, already given state, which we turn into the world for us. The world in itself is a paradoxical concept The moment we think it and attempt to act on it, it ceases to be the world in itself and becomes the world for us. A significant part of this paradoxical world in itself is grounded by scientific inquiry, both the production of scientific knowledge of the world and the technical means of acting on it and intervening in the world. Even though there is something out there that is not the world for us, and even though we can name it the world in itself, the latter constitutes a horizon for thought, always receding just beyond the bounds of intelligibility. Tragically, or most reminded of the world in itself, when the world in itself is manifest in the form of natural disasters. The discussions of the long-term impact of climate change also evoke the remainder of the world in itself, as the specter of extinction furtively looms over such discussions. Using advanced predictive models, we have imagined what would happen to the world if we as human beings were to become extinct. So while we can never experience the world in itself, we seem to be almost fatalistically drawn to it, perhaps as a limit that defines who we are as human beings. Let us call this spectral and speculative world as the world without us. In a sense, the world without us allows us to think the world in itself without getting caught up in a vicious cycle of the logical paradigm. And so that's just a way to kind of note. And these are important distinctions because in a lot of horror, these distinctions are what drive the philosophical terror. So in cosmic horror, such in the Lovecraftian fashion, or in even like, you know, the cosmic absurdity of, like, say, a show like Rick and Morty, the cosmic horror is brought from the idea that the world in itself and the universe is not antagonistic, not pro, but purely indifferent to humanity. And so, yeah, that was essentially the starting point. I was going to have a few other talking points, but any thoughts so far?
That's kind of a lot to take in, but
yeah, it's
like what I got was I hope that it's your main point, which is the distinction between the world of human experience, the world objective, the objective world, that we have a certain empirical scientific notion that which we observe is there whether or not we observe it. That's the world in itself.
In a way.
And the world without us is, what would the world be without the human experience? Is that it?
Kind of. So the world in and of itself is the world without humans in a way, but it's like we use science as a way to convert the world in itself to the world for us, the world that we can understand. So it's more about even being able to understand such concepts. Like, we cannot understand the world in itself because we are not the world. We are us. And that's where we get, if you look at a lot of horror, like you can even look at things like Wiccanism, and like the magic circle is a good example of, you know, how in a lot, it happens in a lot of stories as well, like in Faust it happens, but you know, you draw like Wiccans will like draw the magic circle, right? And it kind of that circle is in a way a boundary between us and then the world in and of itself, because that boundary is where supposedly the rituals will bring forth, in the Wiccanism, or at least in some Wiccanisms and mystics, they believe it is a way to interact with the supernatural, the world that is just hidden beneath the world that we see. And that hiddenness is a perfect example of what we might imagine by the world in and of itself, because it is always hidden and it's always behind the existence that we can retrieve and we do have, but we want to try to access it and to achieve it. In horror, this is usually in the form of maybe another dimension that a character has to like slip in and out of, or maybe in Wiccanism is for reacting to natural spirits within the world, or for even in like mainstream religions like Christianity or Judaism or Islam, it could be seen as the supernatural, the interaction between the above natural, the God, and the world for us, the experience.
You can probably tell that this is not my area of expertise, so it's like, I have difficulty to follow all of it. Well, not all of it, but I mean,
yeah,
it's not all which I understood. Because
I get that too. It is. I'm looking back now. It is a little dense. It did take me a while to write the stuff out, but
anyway, carry on. If you have something to.
Well, so we can look at the different ages of horror, and I think these would be interesting because these are like some arguments for what they could be. So we could look at the Middle Ages of horror being around showing and hiding, right? So there were tons of books and dictionaries and cornucopias of information about what evil or what the supernatural, this might be specifically about supernatural horror, but what the supernatural, how does it manifest itself? Demonologies, what do demons look like? How do they act? How do they manifest themselves? Like the Salem witch trials are a good example of this, or like how people were afraid of witches and they thought, witches would manifest themselves in cats or in dogs. It's showing that like the horror was mainly about what is hiding and what is shown. And it's that dichotomy of what can we see and what can we not, right? Kind of like almost like, are you afraid of the dark type sentiment. And we can even see that, in just the way like some of these, some of the old stories are, some of the old monsters are the ones that are hiding and until it reveals itself to you, and that creates the horror, right? Like those folk tales where it's like, the monster comes in and like steals the kids or whatever. If we move on to the Enlightenment age, we could look at it from the idea of knowing and believing, which makes sense. The Enlightenment was all about casting into secular rationality. And that's where you can look at some interesting, there's a few philosophical essays about it that like look at if we take what happens if we negate experience. Like Descartes did a famous essay about like what happens if I just negate any logical rule I have and what creates, and that kind of creates the horror of philosophy in a way. That would be common in what we could describe as Enlightenment. Where it gets interesting is I think this is where your input could be very interesting, is like how do you feel about modern horror and how do you feel about the modern like anxieties of when it comes to the postmodern age of horror, which is the idea of one and none. So that the idea that is existence, it kind of comes to an existential question of like, is existence individualized or is nothing matter? Or is there a purpose for existence? Should one exist or should one not exist? Is there one or is there none? And I'd like to get your input on like, how do you think that concept of the postmodern, how do you think that, do you think that describes what you would consider like the contemporary horror in a way?
I'm not sure how that ties into horror contemporarily, but you ask about whether we should or should not exist, and what's the problems that we face in having a purpose, which is like the observation that there's not really a reason why there should be any purpose, but I mean I simply go with the starting point of what I value, and then I go from there, instead of saying, oh, my desires are somewhat arbitrary, therefore nihilism. But I mean,
well, that's the anxiety, right? So what I meant by that was not necessarily the question, but the anxiety around it, right? Because there is an anxiety around such a question, especially in a more secular world, right? Because if you have a supernatural being of existence, then this question isn't brought up. And that's why I think there's an argument to be made that it's the new horror, the new philosophical horror, at least, of what is the anxieties of the contemporary age when it comes to existence. Like, is the purpose of existence there, and how does one answer it, and those kind of questions.
I mean, for the talking about secularism, like before, let's say some people, a lot of people had a religious framework that integrates them into their community, but now we have other communities. So although one of the sources of, let's say, meaning and integrating our lives together, let's say that one of the sources for that is removed with the rise of secularism and atheism, but that doesn't mean that there aren't others. So yeah. I mean, I don't know about other people who have like nihilistic anxieties, but because for me, as I said, I simply start from what I value, and that's my purpose, which happens to be individual development. I'm fine enough by myself to sustain myself, but I'm not sure about other people. So that's mainly where my difficulty comes. It's that I'm not really sure of how other people consider the question of the anxieties of not knowing what we should value.
Yeah,
because one of the ways that we could see it is that, let's say there aren't any imposed meanings, but that doesn't mean that there aren't any meanings to pursue. It means that we have the freedom to choose the values that we have.
And I think that's like an interesting way of looking at it, but I do think I know you wanted to maybe talk about one of the topics you brought up in our chat before this was how to escape solipsism.
Yeah.
And I think that we can talk about that a little bit, because I think that actually ties in well with this horror philosophy, right? That like the solipsism being the idea that only one's mind is sure to exist, that only your perception can be true. And that brings up this like big anxiety of maybe not the postmodern, but at least the modern anxiety of existence and subjectivity, right? Where we start questioning, can the world outside of us exist? And then, so I was wondering, like, that is a horror and anxiety of philosophy that is brought forward. And I was wondering, like, wondering what you wanted to say about how to escape such solipsisms, or what is the solution to this anxiety?
I mean, as I said again, you observe yourself and you make conclusions about what you should do by taking that into account with what you observe. So, I mean, that's simply to say that you must act in the world, because if you don't act, then you're kind of nothing. And so that's one of the blows to solipsism, which is that you still have, which is whether or not other people really exist, you still gotta deal with them. So that's one of the main things that I'd say in terms of coping with solipsism.
Would you say that solipsism could imply the destruction of any ethics, right? Like, do you think that is a conclusion that can be drawn from solipsism?
Probably, but I'm not sure of, because, okay, that's a nice can of worms that we could open, but we'd probably need to tentatively see what's at the beginning of the rabbit hole, let's say, because okay, the solipsism doesn't necessarily erase all ethics, because ethics is how to behave oneself, right?
In a way.
So it's like, regardless of what you think of the reality of other people, it doesn't erase that you need to act well for yourself. And yeah, although one of the main parts of ethics is regarding other people as with their moral value that they deserve, which is one of the main things that solipsism results in the reduction of. Although that's one of the things that results from solipsism, if you focus on how you should behave, like a lot of the times you simply forget about solipsism and just go on your merry way, because when you actually live your life, whether or not you're a solipsist or not at the starting point, what happens is that you live your life and you realize that it's not that important, because there's still tremendous value in cooperating with others and treating them with some kind of respect, whatever that might mean.
Yeah. And yeah, I think that's where like things where like dualism could be used against the concept of solipsism, right? That you could have the immaterial and the material. Then again, solipsism is kind of an axiomatic statement. Not necessarily axiomatic. It's a rigorous. It's a want to have pure rigor in things that you can't necessarily have rigor in, right? Like I can't prove to myself or to anybody that the other people around me have consciousness. I have to kind of take that as a given by the way that they treat me and I react to them. And I think that's where the solipsism becomes, it gets its leverage, in that it would argue that such axioms, such as just taking that other people have consciousness, is an unfair claim. And so that's where I think maybe solipsism isn't like necessarily something that someone that like just personally believes. I think maybe it's more of a logical, it's just what happens when you have axiomatic systems. When you have axiomatic systems, there's an argument to be made against the axiom and the conclusion. So if we take the axiom that reality exists, the anti-axiom to that, per se, is reality doesn't exist and it's all in your own head. Right?
I think so. I kind of drifted off because I was looking up solipsism for some useful information on Wikipedia, but I think I got the main idea. I think. It's like from what I understand, solipsism is the observation of the knowledge of you yourself being a conscious being, and if you try to extend that to other people, you have the doubt of, I can't tell for sure because they are separate from me.
Yes. And I think that's where that's like the anti-axiom. It's like we have to kind of axiomatically take the idea that reality exists. We don't have like a proof of that. We just gotta do it, right? Because, if me and another person see a box We agree on what the box looks like. We just kind of takes it axiomatically that the space that we are in and the space the box occurs in, and that our analysis of each other and our analysis of the box is in some shared medium. And so I think the solipsist would say, maybe it's not. Maybe it's all contained in one. And that contained in one means that you don't know that reality is real. Which I think this is at like a very abstract level. I don't think anyone's going outside saying, oh, this tree isn't real because I can't verify it. Because they would just touch the tree.
Depending on what you mean, well, not specifically you, but any hypothetical which I might ask, depending on what you define as real, you cannot say that there is no reality, because by definition, if there is something, and the solipsist claim is that there's only your own, which you can be sure of, there's still you, and the fact that there is something, it implies existence, but existence implies something in which it exists in. So,
sorry, can you run that back through again? So, existence implies
that there is something. For example, the singular consciousness of solipsism. Like, if you think that you're the only conscious being, it still means that you are something, and the fact that you are something, it means that you exist. And existence itself implies directly a reality. Because, of course, depending on what you mean by existence and reality, there cannot be anything without a reality in which it exists. So we could argue, oh, the reality that I perceive is nothing but an illusion. I'm a brain in a vat, stimulated by some alien beings to perceive a false view of the world. But even that means that there is a brain in a vat with some advanced being that are stimulating you. There is still reality.
Well, maybe. I think this is where, let's take your argument, and I think it makes sense that, like, if there is something that you can know, which is you, that you are something, and therefore your existence, therefore you must exist in something. I think that makes sense, but I think there's everything that can be imagined is not necessarily real to colloquial standards, right? I could imagine a cartoon character, and unless I draw the cartoon, it's not necessarily real. Hell, people might even say when I draw the cartoon and play the cartoon, since it's a cartoon, it's not real. But that's a colloquialism.
Yeah,
I would like to make...
Go on.
So, I think this is an interesting thought experiment. Let's say you have a bunch of, let's say, brains in vats or just people in pods or something, and you are the mastermind and you're controlling a little matrix for every one of them. The matrices are not shared. Each person is in their own personalized matrix society / world that their brain is actively interacting with. So their consciousness, for lack of finer terms, is existing within this matrix, and you control it, and you have created all of it so that that person can interact with them. Does that then mean you are ethically required to keep that simulation alive? Because I think where you can bring in an interesting idea is that since the consciousness, which we have said is real, is interacting and thinking and dealing with and having relationships and existing with other people inside, even if those other people are just cardboard cutouts, they have become in a sense real as well. And because of their relation to reality, or at least to the real object we have. Namely that, like, if we have something real and something else interacts with it, that other thing is probably real as well. And so with all this interaction, did you then in turn create millions of people? Some of them you had direct intervention in, but you create millions of people to interact with the one real thing. Did you in turn then create millions of real people? And therefore, if we follow, just a mainstream, like, straightforward, we should try and keep people alive type of ethics, would then terminating the simulation while keeping the consciousness alive and bringing them out of their pod or whatever, and they get to walk around and do stuff, would that then in turn be akin to killing a world? Would that be, in a way, world ending?
In some sense it is, but let's say I'm the mastermind and I terminate the simulation so that they come bursting out of their pods and coming to coming to the real world. Well, of course we can always wonder what that means, but anyway, they come out of their previous notion of reality into a different one. Of course, that's gonna be disorienting for quite a while. But if they know that what they had before was all an illusion, I would say that the moral worth of whatever else they've been doing before is not entirely destroyed, because of course if they have, let's say, interacted with artificial beings in their simulation world, and they have an emotional attachment, let's say, this is kind of hard to really express precisely what I'm trying to mean, but like, of course it's gonna be a shock to come into a different reality, and perhaps because the persons to which they've been emotionally attached were not real and were only an illusion, perhaps we could say that they didn't really lose them. But in another sense, it's kind of wrong if you cut off all that they enjoyed, let's say. But if they come out better at the end by bursting out of their virtual reality, I'd say that the sacrifice is worth it if at the end they're better. But of course it might wildly depend on the outcome and the desirability of the awakening. It's gonna depend on each consciousness.
I think the question to ask is, did the people that you create, so we can say that they're not real when you create them, they're just binary code or whatever in the machine magic thing we have that does it. Do they become real when they interact with the consciousness? Because that consciousness, they're real. Does reality become transitive in a sense, where you say like, oh, I'm real and I interact with this thing, therefore that thing is real, right? Because I interact with unreal things.
Well, I think that the one of the things that you mentioned before is that their reality. One of the ways that people, one of the things that people mean by if something is real is whether there's a match between what they perceive and what is. And if we have a virtual thing that we interact with, it's a similar situation that if I'm tricked to perceive a person in front of me in a virtual world, and I see a person, but in fact it's just a hologram, what is an hologram. What I perceive is a person, and like if like that, the fact that I interact with the hologram, which I think is a person, like in one, like coming from the inside, it doesn't make the hologram real, but coming from the inside, I still place value in the person which I am interacting with. If let's say I like the person, or
I guess then the seminal question would be, when does it become real? Not just to the person inside, but to the person outside. So obviously, if we do like an Oculus thing, and you just put the Oculus on, and you like shake hands with a bunch of like video game people, we wouldn't call that necessarily real, and shutting off the game isn't, ethically reprehensible. But what if we could imagine to where the people that we create in the simulation for the consciousness to interact with, at what point do they become real? Even though there's simulation, I think there's an argument to be made that if they become human enough to where that the consciousness can't decipher between humanity and not inhumanity, do they become in a way real and therefore human?
Well,
it's like the AI question, right? Like, at what point is it ethical to terminate an AI? If an AI was able to, be human.
Well, I don't know, with your example with the Oculus and the other more advanced simulated people, you're still saying the same thing, but at a different level of sophistication.
Yeah,
I guess that what you meant was, let's say we have a small unsophisticated virtual being that we're interacted with, and that's different in believability to another virtual being which we might interact with in a more advanced simulation, which is far more believable, and therefore there's the doubt of how can we know if it is real, and when does it become real if it is believable enough to be a consciousness.
Yes. And I think that's why I think this problem could be reduced down to just the simple question that I think is easier to work with of, let's say I have a computer program that exhibits humanity. Is that a person? I think that's like the transhumanist question. Not necessarily transhumanist, but like, a good example could be like the synths in Fallout 4. Have you played Fallout 4?
No.
Oh, well then maybe not that.
Well, I've recently watched a video that reviews Fallout 4, and what I understood is that the synths are some kind of machines that are modeled after human beings, and they integrate in society for whatever purposes.
Well, that's where it gets complicated. So the synths are robots. They don't, but in some ways they create certain synths that have pure consciousness. They have memories, they have emotions, and they're human in a way, in ways like that. If humans have this trait, the synth probably also has this trait when it comes down to like the experience. So the question becomes, do we treat them like robots or do we treat them like humans? Right? Especially since if you can't tell, because that's where at least in the game, they show the fear of people have against, the robots, because they can't tell the difference between a person and a robot. It creates an anxiety of, is the synth right next to me? Because you could never tell. And so I think there's a solid argument that they are human at that point. And that maybe there is an ethical question of, is it okay to turn them off?
I think, before I answer that, I might need a little bit of thought of about what I thought about this question before. But one of the things that I might be inclined to consider about this issue is that if you have machines that behave sufficiently like humans, then we can't simply say that they are humans if they are machines. But the moral value that we ascribe to them is really the question at play here. I think that, like, if we have some artificial intelligences that are made to look and act like humans, like, one of the problems in considering them more like humans is that if they are designed to act like us, it's essentially they're in some sense they are just made to trick us. Not in the sense of the purpose in making these robots is to make other people believe that the robots are human. But it's like for example, the Turing test. You know what it is, yeah?
Yeah.
If you have the artificial intelligence that looks human, it doesn't give it really a human character, because any AI that has a good enough psychological model of what it knows about how people act and how people think, it could trick us super easily, and that would not make it that would not give it the moral value of a human. Because, like, if its purpose is to act like a human, it's not the same thing as it being more like a human. If you have some kind of anthropomorphic robots that, let's say, they start with some default state, and then they can learn from the world around, and, for example, us, if they develop human sentiments, I think that this would make them more human than simply a robot that is made to be similar to a human.
Yeah. I mean, I guess the question is, it leads to a fundamental question of, what does it even mean to be human?
Yeah, we have a few starting points usually, but as you say, it's like the specifics of it is not fully known. It's like one of the things that makes us human is that we feel emotions and we are attached to people we love, and we have a certain kind of passion that drives us, which motivates us to do things that to do things in the face of the nature of the world, which is not necessarily favorable to us. That's part of the human spirit. But
yeah,
and again, what is that emotion? And what is this motivation which we're speaking of? I don't know.
Yeah, that's a hard question.
So I guess that how to beat solipsism is simply to accept reality and live.
Yeah. But it is kind of an interesting topic, especially when you tie it in with the idea that like that is kind of the horror of philosophy. I think that it kind of negates our ability to understand the world around us.
Right. Got anything else?
Oh no, that's it for me.
Okay, I guess that's a satisfying end. Yeah, I'll stop recording.